am ready to believe, Captain," replied Dick Sand, "that we have to do with a Jubart. See how his rents throw that column of liquid violently into the air. Does it not seem to you also, which would confirm my idea, that that spout contains more water than condensed vapor? And if I am not mistaken, it is a special peculiarity of the Jubart." "In fact, Dick," replied Captain Hull, "there is no longer any doubt possible. It is a Jubart which floats on the surface of these red waters." "That's fine," cried little Jack. "Yes, my boy, and when we think that the great beast is there, in process of breakfasting, and little suspecting that the whalers are watching it. I would dare to affirm that it is a Jubart of great size," observed Dick Sand. "Truly," replied Captain Hull, who was gradually becoming more excited. "I think it is at least 70 feet long." "Good," added the boatswain. "Half a dozen whales of that size would suffice to fill a ship as large as ours." "Yes, that would be sufficient," replied Captain Hull, who mounted on the bowsprit to see better. "And with this one," added the boatswain, "we should take on board in a few hours the half of the 200 barrels of oil which we lack." "Yes, truly yes," murmured Captain Hull. "That is true," continued Dick Sand, "but it is sometimes a hard matter to attack those enormous Jubarts." Very hard," returned Captain Hull. "Those ballonopters have formidable tails which must not be approached without distrust. The strongest pirogue would not resist a well-given blow, but then the profit is worth the trouble." "Bah," said one of the sailors, "a fine Jubart is all the same a fine capture." "And profitable," replied another. "It would be a pity not to salute this one on the way." It was evident that these brave sailors were growing excited in looking at the whale. It was a whole cargo of barrels of oil that was floating within reach of their hands. To hear them, without doubt there was nothing more to be done, except to stow those barrels in the Pilgrim's hold to complete her lading. Some of the sailors, mounted on the ratlins of the foreshrouds, uttered longing cries. Captain Hull, who no longer spoke, was in a dilemma. There was something there, like an irresistible magnet, which attracted the Pilgrim and all her crew. "Mamma, mamma," then cried little Jack, "I should like to have the whale to see how it is made." "Ah, you wish to have this whale, my boy? Ah, why not, my friends?" replied Captain Hull, finally yielding to his secret desire. "Our additional fishermen are lacking, it is true, but we alone." "Yes, yes," cried the sailors with a single voice. "This will not be the first time that I have followed the trade of harpooner," added Captain Hull, "and you will see if I still know how to throw the harpoon." "Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah," responded the crew. Chapter 7. Preparations. It will be understood that the sight of this prodigious mammifer was necessary to produce such excitement on board the Pilgrim. The whale, which floated in the middle of the red waters, appeared enormous. To capture it and thus complete the cargo, that was very tempting. Could fishermen let such an occasion escape them? However, Mrs. Weldon believed she ought to ask Captain Hull if it was not dangerous for his men, and for him to attack a whale under those circumstances. "No, Mrs. Weldon," replied Captain Hull. "More than once it has been my lot to hunt the whale with a single boat, and I have always finished by taking possession of it. I repeat it, there is no danger for us, nor, consequently, for yourself." Mrs. Weldon, reassured, did not persist. Captain Hull at once made his preparations for capturing the Jubart. He knew by experience that the pursuit of that ballonopter was not free from difficulties, and he wished to parry all. What rendered this capture less easy was that the schooner's crew could only work by means of a single boat, while the Pilgrim possessed a longboat. Placed on its stocks between the mainmast and the mizzenmast, besides 3 whaleboats, of which 2 were suspended on the larboard and starboard pegs, and the third aft, outside the crownwork. Generally, these 3 whaleboats were employed simultaneously in the pursuit of cetaceans. But during the fishing season, we know an additional crew, hired at the stations of New Zealand, came to the assistance of the Pilgrim's sailors. Now, in the present circumstances, the Pilgrim could only furnish the 5 sailors on board. That is, enough to arm a single whaleboat. To utilize the group of Tom and his friends, who had offered themselves at once, was impossible. In fact, the working of a fishing pirogue requires very well-trained seamen. A false move of the helm, or a false stroke of an oar, would be enough to compromise the safety of the whaleboat during an attack. On the other hand, Captain Hull did not wish to leave his ship without leaving on board at least one man from the crew in whom he had confidence. It was necessary to provide for all eventualities. Now Captain Hull, obliged to choose strong seamen to man the whaleboat, was forced to put on Dick Sand the care of guarding the Pilgrim. "Dick," said he to him, "I shall charge you to remain on board during my absence, which I hope will be short." "Well, sir," replied the young novice. Dick Sand would have wished to take part in this fishing, which had a great attraction for him, but he understood that, for one reason, a man's arms were worth more than his for service in a whaleboat, and that for another, he alone could replace Captain Hull. So he was satisfied. The whaleboat's crew must be composed of the 5 men, including the master, Howick, which formed the whole crew of the Pilgrim. The 4 sailors were going to take their places at the oars, and Howick would hold the stern oar, which serves to guide a boat of this kind. A simple rudder, in fact, would not have a prompt enough action, and in case the side oars should be disabled, the stern oar, well handled, could put the whaleboat beyond the reach of the monster's blows. There was only Captain Hull besides. He had reserved to himself the post of harpooner, and, as he had said, this would not be his first attempt. It was he who must first throw the harpoon, then watch the unrolling of the long line fastened at its end, then, finally finish the animal with spears when it should return to the surface of the ocean. Whalers sometimes employ firearms for this kind of fishing. By means of a special instrument, a sort of small cannon, stationed either on board the ship or at the front of the boat, they throw either a harpoon, which draws with it the rope fastened to its end, or explosive balls, which produce great ravages in the body of the animal. But the Pilgrim was not furnished with apparatus of this kind. This was, besides, an instrument of high price, rather difficult to manage, and fishermen, but little friendly to innovations, seemed to prefer the employment of primitive weapons which they used skillfully, that is to say, the harpoon and spear. It was then by the usual method, attacking the whale with the sword, that Captain Hull was going to attempt to capture the Jubart signaled 5 miles from his ship. Besides, the weather would favor this expedition. The sea, being very calm, was propitious for the working of a whaleboat. The wind was going down, and the Pilgrim would only drift in an insensible manner while her crew were occupied in the offing. So the starboard whaleboat was immediately lowered, and the 4 sailors went into it. Howick passed them 2 of those long spears which serve as harpoons, then 2 long lances with sharp points. To those offensive arms he added 5 coils of those strong flexible ropes that the whalers call lines, and which measure 600 feet in length. Less would not do, for it sometimes happens that these cords, fastened end to end, are not enough for the demand. The whale plunges down so deep. Such were the different weapons, which were carefully disposed in the front of the boat. Howick and the 4 sailors only waited for the order to let go the rope. A single place was vacant in the prow of the whaleboat, that which Captain Hull would occupy. It is needless to say that the Pilgrim's crew, before quitting her, had brought the ship's sails aback. In other words, the yards were braced in such a manner that the sails, counteracting their action, kept the vessel almost stationary. Just as he was about to embark, Captain Hull gave a last glance at his ship. He was sure that all was in order, the halyards well turned, the sails suitably trimmed. As he was leaving the young novice on board during an absence which might last several hours, he wished, with a good reason, that unless for some urgent cause, Dick Sand would not have to execute a single maneuver. At the moment of departing, he gave the young man some last words of advice. "Dick," said he, "I leave you alone, watch over everything. If, as is possible, it should become necessary to get the ship under way, in case we should be led too far in pursuit of this Jubart, Tom and his companions could come to your aid perfectly well. After telling them clearly what they would have to do, I am assured that they would do it." "Yes, Captain Hull," replied old Tom, "and Mr. Dick can count on us." "Command, command," cried Bat, "we have such a strong desire to make ourselves useful." "On what must we pull?" asked Hercules, turning up the large sleeves of his jacket. "On nothing just now," replied Dick Sand, smiling. "At your service," continued the Colossus. "Dick," continued Captain Hull, "the weather is beautiful. The wind has gone down. There is no indication that it will freshen again. Above all, whatever may happen, do not put a boat to sea, and do not leave the ship." "That is understood. If it should become necessary for the Pilgrim to come to us, I shall make a signal to you, by hoisting a flag at the end of a boat hook." Rest assured, Captain, I shall not lose sight of the whaleboat, replied Dick Sand. Good, my boy, replied Captain Hull. Courage and coolness. Behold yourself assistant captain. Do honor to your grade. No one has been such at your age. Dick Sand did not reply, but he blushed while smiling. Captain Hull understood that blush and that smile. The honest boy, he said to himself. Modesty and good humor, in truth, it is just like him. Meanwhile, by these urgent recommendations, it was plain that, even though there would be no danger in doing it, Captain Hull did not leave his ship willingly, even for a few hours. But an irresistible fisherman's instinct, above all, the strong desire to complete his cargo of oil, and not fall short of the engagements made by James W. Weldon in Valparaiso, all that told him to attempt the adventure. Besides, that sea, so fine, was marvelously conducive to the pursuit of a cetacean. Neither his crew nor he could resist such a temptation. The fishing cruise would be finally complete, and this last consideration touched Captain Hull's heart above everything. Captain Hull went toward the ladder. I wish you success, said Mrs. Weldon to him. Thank you, Mrs. Weldon. I beg you, do not do too much harm to the poor whale, cried little Jack. No, my boy, replied Captain Hull. Take it very gently, sir. Yes, with gloves, little Jack. Sometimes, observed Cousin Benedict, we find rather curious insects on the back of these large mammals. Well, Mr. Benedict, replied Captain Hull, laughing, you shall have the right to entomologize when our Jubart will be alongside of the Pilgrim. Then turning to Tom. Tom, I count on your companions and you, said he, to assist us in cutting up the whale when it is lashed to the ship's hull, which will not be long. At your disposal, sir, replied the old black. Good, replied Captain Hull. Dick, these honest men will aid you in preparing the empty barrels. During our absence, they will bring them on deck, and by this means the work will go fast on our return. That shall be done, Captain. For the benefit of those who do not know, it is necessary to say that the Jubart, once dead, must be towed as far as the Pilgrim, and firmly lashed to her starboard side. Then the sailors, shod in boots, with cramp hooks would take their places on the back of the enormous cetacean, and cut it up methodically in parallel bands marked off from the head to the tail. These bands would be then cut across in slices of 1.5 feet, then divided into pieces, which, after being stowed in the barrels, would be sent to the bottom of the hold. Generally, the whaling ship, when the fishing is over, manages to land as soon as possible, so as to finish her manipulations. The crew lands and then proceeds to melt the lard, which, under the action of the heat, gives up all its useful part, that is, the oil. In this operation, the whale's lard weighs about 1/3 of its weight. But under present circumstances, Captain Hull could not dream of putting back to finish that operation. He only counted on melting this quantity of lard at Valparaiso. Besides, with winds which could not fail to hail from the west, he hoped to make the American coast before 20 days, and that lapse of time could not compromise the results of his fishing. The moment for setting out had come. Before the Pilgrim's sails had been brought aback, she had drawn a little nearer to the place where the Jubart continued to signal its presence by jets of vapor and water. The Jubart was all this time swimming in the middle of the vast red field of crustaceans, opening its large mouth automatically and absorbing at each draft myriads of animalcules. According to the experienced ones on board, there was no fear that the whale dreamt of escaping. It was, doubtless, what the whalers call a fighting whale. Captain Hull strode over the netting, and, descending the rope ladder, he reached the prow of the whaleboat. Mrs. Weldon, Jack, Cousin Benedict, Tom, and his companions, for a last time wished the captain success. Dingo itself, rising on its paws and passing its head above the railing, seemed to wish to say goodbye to the crew. Then all returned to the prow, so as to lose none of the very attractive movements of such a fishing. The whaleboat put off, and, under the impetus of its 4 oars, vigorously handled, it began to distance itself from the Pilgrim. Watch well, Dick, watch well, cried Captain Hull to the young novice for the last time. Count on me, sir. One eye for the ship, one eye for the whaleboat, my boy, do not forget it. That shall be done, Captain, replied Dick Sand, who went to take his place near the helm. Already the light boat was several hundred feet from the ship. Captain Hull, standing at the prow, no longer able to make himself heard, renewed his injunctions by the most expressive gestures. It was then that Dingo, its paws still resting on the railing, gave a sort of lamentable bark, which would have an unfavorable effect upon men somewhat given to superstition. That bark even made Mrs. Weldon shudder. "Dingo," said she, "Dingo, is that the way you encourage your friends? Come now, a fine bark, very clear, very sonorous, very joyful." But the dog barked no more, and, letting itself fall back on its paws, it came slowly to Mrs. Weldon, whose hand it licked affectionately. "It does not wag its tail," murmured Tom in a low tone. "Bad sign, bad sign." But almost at once Dingo stood up, and a howl of anger escaped it. Mrs. Weldon turned round. Negoro had just left his quarters, and was going toward the forecastle, with the intention, no doubt, of looking for himself at the movements of the whaleboat. Dingo rushed at the head cook, a prey to the strongest as well as to the most inexplicable fury. Negoro seized a handspike and took an attitude of defense. The dog was going to spring at his throat. "Here, Dingo, here!" cried Dick Sand, who, leaving his post of observation for an instant, ran to the prow of the ship. Mrs. Weldon, on her side, sought to calm the dog. Dingo obeyed, not without repugnance, and returned to the young novice, growling secretly. Negoro had not pronounced a single word, but his face had grown pale for a moment. Letting go of his handspike, he regained his cabin. "Hercules," then said Dick Sand, "I charge you especially to watch over that man." "I shall watch," simply replied Hercules, clenching his two enormous fists in sign of assent. Mrs. Weldon and Dick Sand then turned their eyes again on the whaleboat, which the four oarsmen bore rapidly away. It was nothing but a speck on the sea. Chapter 8. The Jubart. Captain Hull, an experienced whaler, would leave nothing to chance. The capture of a Jubart is a difficult thing, no precaution ought to be neglected. None was in this case. And, first of all, Captain Hull sailed so as to come up to the whale on the leeward, so that no noise might disclose the boat's approach. Howick then steered the whaleboat, following the rather elongated curve of that reddish shoal, in the midst of which floated the Jubart. They would thus turn the curve. The boatswain, set over this work, was a seaman of great coolness, who inspired Captain Hull with every confidence. He had not to fear either hesitation or distraction from Howick. "Attention to the steering, Howick," said Captain Hull. "We are going to try to surprise the Jubart. We will only show ourselves when we are near enough to harpoon it." "That is understood, sir," replied the boatswain. "I am going to follow the contour of these reddish waters, so as to keep to the leeward." "Good," said Captain Hull. "Boys, as little noise as possible in rowing." The oars, carefully muffled with straw, worked silently. The boat, skillfully steered by the boatswain, had reached the large shoal of crustaceans. The starboard oars still sank in the green and limpid water, while those to larboard, raising the reddish liquid, seemed to rain drops of blood. "Wine and water," said one of the sailors. "Yes," replied Captain Hull, "but water that we cannot drink, and wine that we cannot swallow. Come, boys, let us not speak any more and heave closer." The whaleboat, steered by the boatswain, glided noiselessly on the surface of those half-greased waters, as if it were floating on a bed of oil. The Jubart did not budge, and did not seem to have yet perceived the boat, which described a circle around it. Captain Hull, in making the circuit, necessarily went farther than the Pilgrim, which gradually grew smaller in the distance. This rapidity with which objects diminish at sea has always an odd effect. It seems as if we look at them shortened through the large end of a telescope. This optical illusion evidently takes place because there are no points of comparison on these large spaces. It was thus with the Pilgrim, which decreased to the eye and seemed already much more distant than she really was. Half an hour after leaving her, Captain Hull and his companions found themselves exactly to the leeward of the whale, so that the latter occupied an intermediate point between the ship and the boat. So the moment had come to approach, while making as little noise as possible. It was not impossible for them to get beside the animal and harpoon it at good range before its attention would be attracted. "Row more slowly, boys," said Captain Hull in a low voice. "It seems to me," replied Howick, "that the gudgeon suspects something. It breathes less violently than it did just now. Silence, silence, repeated Captain Hull. 5 minutes later, the whaleboat was at a cable's length from the Jubart. A cable's length, a measure peculiar to the sea, comprises a length of 120 fathoms, that is to say, 200 meters. The boatswain, standing aft, steered in such a manner as to approach the left side of the mammal, but avoiding, with the greatest care, passing within reach of the formidable tail, a single blow of which would be enough to crush the boat. At the prow, Captain Hull, his legs a little apart to maintain his equilibrium, held the weapon with which he was going to give the first blow. They could count on his skill to fix that harpoon in the thick mass which emerged from the waters. Near the captain, in a pail, was coiled the first of the 5 lines, firmly fastened to the harpoon, and to which they would successively join the other 4 if the whale plunged to great depths. "Are we ready, boys?" murmured Captain Hull. "Yes," replied Howick, grasping his oar firmly in his large hands. "Alongside, alongside." The boatswain obeyed the order, and the whaleboat came within less than 10 feet of the animal. The latter no longer moved and seemed asleep. Whales thus surprised while asleep offer an easier prize, and it often happens that the first blow which is given wounds them mortally. This immovableness is quite astonishing, thought Captain Hull. The rascal ought not to be asleep, and nevertheless, there is something there. The boatswain thought the same, and he tried to see the opposite side of the animal. But it was not the moment to reflect, but to attack. Captain Hull, holding his harpoon by the middle of the handle, balanced it several times, to make sure of good aim, while he examined the Jubart's side. Then he threw it with all the strength of his arm. "Back, back," cried he at once. And the sailors, pulling together, made the boat recoil rapidly, with the intention of prudently putting it in safety from the blows of the cetacean's tail. But at that moment, a cry from the boatswain made them understand why the whale was so extraordinarily motionless for so long a time on the surface of the sea. "A young whale," said he. In fact, the Jubart, after having been struck by the harpoon, was almost entirely overturned on the side, thus discovering a young whale, which she was in process of suckling. This circumstance, as Captain Hull well knew, would render the capture of the Jubart much more difficult. The mother was evidently going to defend herself with greater fury, as much for herself as to protect her little one, if, indeed, we can apply that epithet to an animal which did not measure less than 20 feet. Meanwhile, the Jubart did not rush at the boat, as there was reason to fear, and there was no necessity, before taking flight, to quickly cut the line which connected the boat with the harpoon. On the contrary, and as generally happens, the whale, followed by the young one, dived, at first in a very oblique line. Then rising again with an immense bound, she commenced to cleave the waters with extreme rapidity. But before she had made her first plunge, Captain Hull and the boatswain, both standing, had had time to see her, and consequently to estimate her at her true value. This Jubart was, in reality, a whale of the largest size. From the head to the tail, she measured at least 80 feet. Her skin, of a yellowish brown, was much varied with numerous spots of a darker brown. It would indeed be a pity, after an attack so happily begun, to be under the necessity of abandoning so rich a prey. The pursuit, or rather the towing, had commenced. The whaleboat, whose oars had been raised, darted like an arrow while swinging on the tops of the waves. Howick kept it steady, notwithstanding those rapid and frightful oscillations. Captain Hull, his eye on his prey, did not cease making his eternal refrain. "Be watchful, Howick, be watchful." And they could be sure that the boatswain's vigilance would not be at fault for an instant. Meanwhile, as the whaleboat did not fly nearly as fast as the whale, the line of the harpoon spun out with such rapidity that it was to be feared that it would take fire in rubbing against the edge of the whaleboat. So Captain Hull took care to keep it damp, by filling with water the pail at the bottom of which the line was coiled. All this time, the Jubart did not seem inclined to stop her flight, nor willing to moderate it. The second line was then lashed to the end of the first, and it was not long before it was played out with the same velocity. At the end of 5 minutes, it was necessary to join on the third line, which ran off under the water. The Jubart did not stop. The harpoon had evidently not penetrated into any vital part of the body. They could even observe, by the increased obliquity of the line, that the animal, instead of returning to the surface, was sinking into lower depths. "The devil," cried Captain Hull, "but that rascal will use up our 5 lines." "And lead us to a good distance from the Pilgrim," replied the boatswain. "Nevertheless, she must return to the surface to breathe," replied Captain Hull. "She is not a fish, and she must have the provision of air like a common individual." "She has held her breath to run better," said one of the sailors, laughing. In fact, the line was unrolling all the time with equal rapidity. To the third line, it was soon necessary to join the fourth, and that was not done without making the sailors somewhat anxious, touching their future part of the prize. The devil," murmured Captain Hull. "I have never seen anything like that, devilish Jubart." Finally, the fifth line had to be let out, and it was already half unrolled when it seemed to slacken. "Good, good," cried Captain Hull. "The line is less stiff, the Jubart is getting tired." At that moment, the Pilgrim was more than 5 miles to the leeward of the whaleboat. Captain Hull, hoisting a flag at the end of a boathook, gave the signal to come nearer. And almost at once, he could see that Dick Sand, aided by Tom and his companions, commenced to brace the yards in such a manner as to trim them close to the wind. But the breeze was feeble and irregular. It only came in short puffs. Most certainly, the Pilgrim would have some trouble in joining the whaleboat if indeed she could reach it. Meanwhile, as they had foreseen, the Jubart had returned to the surface of the water to breathe, with the harpoon fixed in her side all the time. She then remained almost motionless, seeming to wait for her young whale, which this furious course must have left behind. Captain Hull made use of the oars so as to join her again, and soon he was only a short distance from her. 2 oars were laid down and 2 sailors armed themselves, as the captain had done, with long lances, intended to strike the enemy. Howick worked skillfully then, and held himself ready to make the boat turn rapidly, in case the whale should turn suddenly on it. "Attention," cried Captain Hull. "Do not lose a blow, aim well, boys." "Are we ready, Howick?" "I am prepared, sir," replied the boatswain, "but one thing troubles me. It is that the beast, after having fled so rapidly, is very quiet now." "In fact, Howick, that seems to me suspicious. Let us be careful." "Yes, but let us go forward." Captain Hull grew more and more animated. The boat drew still nearer. The Jubart only turned in her place. Her young one was no longer near her. Perhaps she was trying to find it again. Suddenly, she made a movement with her tail, which took her 30 feet away. Was she then going to take flight again? And must they take up this interminable pursuit again on the surface of the waters? "Attention," cried Captain Hull. "The beast is going to take a spring and throw herself on us. Steer, Howick, steer." The Jubart, in fact, had turned in such a manner as to present herself in front of the whaleboat. Then, beating the sea violently with her enormous fins, she rushed forward. The boatswain, who expected this direct blow, turned in such a fashion that the Jubart passed by the boat, but without reaching it. Captain Hull and the 2 sailors gave her 3 vigorous thrusts on the passage, seeking to strike some vital organ. The Jubart stopped, and, throwing to a great height 2 columns of water mingled with blood, she turned anew on the boat, bounding, so to say, in a manner frightful to witness. These seamen must have been expert fishermen, not to lose their presence of mind on this occasion. Howick again skillfully avoided the Jubart's attack by darting the boat aside. 3 new blows, well aimed, again gave the animal 3 new wounds. But, in passing, she struck the water so roughly with her formidable tail that an enormous wave arose as if the sea were suddenly opened. The whaleboat almost capsized, and, the water rushing in over the side, it was half filled. The bucket," cried Captain Hull. The 2 sailors, letting go their oars, began to bail out the boat rapidly, while the captain cut the line, now become useless. No, the animal, rendered furious by grief, no longer dreamt of flight. It was her turn to attack, and her agony threatened to be terrible. A third time she turned round, head to head, a seaman would say, and threw herself anew on the boat. But the whaleboat, half full of water, could no longer move with the same facility. In this condition, how could it avoid the shock which threatened it? If it could be no longer steered, there was still less power to escape. And besides, no matter how quickly the boat might be propelled, the swift Jubart would have always overtaken it with a few bounds. It was no longer a question of attack, but of defense. Captain Hull understood it all. The third attack of the animal could not be entirely kept off. In passing, she grazed the whaleboat with her enormous dorsal fin, but with so much force that Howick was thrown down from his bench. The three lances, unfortunately affected by the oscillation, this time missed their aim. Howick, Howick, cried Captain Hull, who himself had been hardly able to keep his place. Present, replied the boatswain as he got up, but he then perceived that in his fall his stern oar had broken in the middle. Another oar, said Captain Hull. I have one, replied Howick. At that moment, a bubbling took place under the waters, only a few fathoms from the boat. The young whale had just reappeared. The Jubart saw it and rushed towards it. This circumstance could only give a more terrible character to the contest. The whale was going to fight for two. Captain Hull looked toward the Pilgrim. His hand shook the boathook, which bore the flag frantically. What could Dick Sand do that had not been already done at the first signal from the captain? The Pilgrim's sails were trimmed, and the wind commenced to fill them. Unhappily, the schooner did not possess a helix, by which the action could be increased to sail faster. To lower one of the boats, and, with the aid of the blacks, row to the assistance of the captain, would be a considerable loss of time. Besides, the novice had orders not to quit the ship, no matter what happened. However, he had the stern boat lowered from its pegs and towed it along so that the captain and his companions might take refuge in it in case of need. At that moment, the Jubart, covering the young whale with her body, had returned to the charge. This time she turned in such a manner as to reach the boat exactly. Attention, Howick, cried Captain Hull for the last time. But the boatswain was, so to speak, disarmed. Instead of a lever whose length gave force, he only held in his hand an oar relatively short. He tried to put about, it was impossible. The sailors knew that they were lost. All rose, giving a terrible cry, which was perhaps heard on the Pilgrim. A terrible blow from the monster's tail had just struck the whaleboat underneath. The boat, thrown into the air with irresistible violence, fell back, broken in three pieces, in the midst of waves furiously lashed by the whale's bounds. The unfortunate sailors, although grievously wounded, would have had, perhaps, the strength to keep up still, either by swimming or by hanging on to some of the floating wreck. That is what Captain Hull did, for he was seen for a moment hoisting the boatswain on a wreck. But the Jubart, in the last degree of fury, turned round, sprang up, perhaps in the last pangs of a terrible agony, and with her tail she beat the troubled waters frightfully, where the unfortunate sailors were still swimming. For some minutes one saw nothing but a liquid waterspout scattering itself in sheafs on all sides. A quarter of an hour after, when Dick Sand, who, followed by the blacks, had rushed into the boat, had reached the scene of the catastrophe, every living creature had disappeared. There was nothing left but some pieces of the whaleboat on the surface of the waters, red with blood. Chapter 9. Captain Sand. The first impression felt by the passengers of the Pilgrim, in presence of this terrible catastrophe, was a combination of pity and horror. They only thought of this frightful death of Captain Hull and the five sailors. This fearful scene had just taken place almost under their eyes, while they could do nothing to save the poor men. They had not even been able to arrive in time to pick up the whaleboat's crew, their unfortunate companions, wounded but still living, and to oppose the Pilgrim's hull to the Jubart's formidable blows. Captain Hull and his men had forever disappeared. When the schooner arrived at the fatal place, Mrs. Weldon fell on her knees, her hands raised toward heaven. "Let us pray," said the pious woman. She was joined by her little Jack, who threw himself on his knees, weeping near his mother. The poor child understood it all. Dick Sand, Nan, Tom, and the other blacks remained standing, their heads bowed. All repeated the prayer that Mrs. Weldon addressed to God, recommending to his infinite goodness those who had just appeared before him. Then Mrs. Weldon, turning to her companions, "And now, my friends," said she, "let us ask heaven for strength and courage for ourselves." Yes, they could not too earnestly implore the aid of him who can do all things, for their situation was one of the gravest. This ship which carried them had no longer a captain to command her, no longer a crew to work her. She was in the middle of that immense Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles from any land, at the mercy of the winds and waves. What fatality then had brought that whale in the Pilgrim's course? What still greater fatality had urged the unfortunate Captain Hull, generally so wise, to risk everything in order to complete his cargo. And what a catastrophe to count among the rarest of the annals of whale fishing was this one, which did not allow of the saving of one of the whale boat's sailors. Yes, it was a terrible fatality. In fact, there was no longer a seaman on board the Pilgrim. Yes, one Dick Sand, and he was only a beginner, a young man of 15. Captain, boatswain, sailors, it may be said that the whole crew was now concentrated in him. On board there was one lady passenger, a mother and her son, whose presence would render the situation much more difficult. Then there were also some blacks, honest men, courageous and zealous without a doubt, ready to obey whoever should undertake to command them, but ignorant of the simplest notions of the sailor's craft. Dick Sand stood motionless, his arms crossed, looking at the place where Captain Hull had just been swallowed up. Captain Hull, his protector, for whom he felt a filial affection. Then his eyes searched the horizon, seeking to discover some ship from which he would demand aid and assistance, to which he might be able at least to confide Mrs. Weldon. He would not abandon the Pilgrim, no, indeed, without having tried his best to bring her into port. But Mrs. Weldon and her little boy would be in safety. He would have had nothing more to fear for those two beings, to whom he was devoted body and soul. The ocean was deserted. Since the disappearance of the Jubart, not a speck came to alter the surface. All was sky and water around the Pilgrim. The young novice knew only too well that he was beyond the routes followed by the ships of commerce, and that the other whalers were cruising still farther away at the fishing grounds. However, the question was to look the situation in the face, to see things as they were. That is what Dick Sand did, asking God from the depths of his heart for aid and succor. What resolution was he going to take? At that moment, Negoro appeared on the deck, which he had left after the catastrophe. What had been felt in the presence of this irreparable misfortune by a being so enigmatical, no one could tell. He had contemplated the disaster without making a gesture, without departing from his speechlessness. His eye had evidently seized all the details of it, but if at such a moment one could think of observing him, he would be astonished at least, because not a muscle of his impassible face had moved. At any rate, and as if he had not heard it, he had not responded to the pious appeal of Mrs. Weldon, praying for the engulfed crew. Negoro walked aft, there even where Dick Sand was standing motionless. He stopped 3 steps from the novice. "You wish to speak to me?" asked Dick Sand. "I wish to speak to Captain Hull," replied Negoro coolly, "or, in his absence, to Boatswain Howick." "You know well that both have perished," cried the novice. "Then who commands on board now?" asked Negoro very insolently. "I," replied Dick Sand without hesitation. "You," said Negoro, shrugging his shoulders, "a captain of 15 years." "A captain of 15 years," replied the novice, advancing toward the cook. The latter drew back. "Do not forget it," then said Mrs. Weldon. "There is but one captain here, Captain Sand, and it is well for all to remember that he will know how to make himself obeyed." Negoro bowed, murmuring in an ironical tone a few words that they could not understand, and he returned to his post. We see Dick's resolution was taken. Meanwhile, the schooner, under the action of the breeze, which commenced to freshen, had already passed beyond the vast shoal of crustaceans. Dick Sand examined the condition of the sails, then his eyes were cast on the deck. He had then this sentiment that, if a frightful responsibility fell upon him in the future, it was for him to have the strength to accept it. He dared to look at the survivors of the Pilgrim, whose eyes were now fixed on him. And, reading in their faces that he could count on them, he said to them in 2 words that they could in their turn count on him. Dick Sand had, in all sincerity, examined his conscience. If he was capable of taking in or setting the sails of the schooner, according to circumstances, by employing the arms of Tom and his companions, he evidently did not yet possess all the knowledge necessary to determine his position by calculation. In 4 or 5 years more, Dick Sand would know thoroughly that beautiful and difficult sailor's craft. He would know how to use the sextant, that instrument which Captain Hull's hand had held every day and which gave him the height of the stars. He would read on the chronometer the hour of the meridian of Greenwich, and from it would be able to deduce the longitude by the hour angle. The sun would be made his counselor each day. The moon, the planets would say to him, "There on that point of the ocean is thy ship." That firmament on which the stars move like the hands of a perfect clock, which nothing shakes nor can derange, and whose accuracy is absolute, that firmament would tell him the hours and the distances. By astronomical observations he would know, as his captain had known every day, nearly to a mile, the place occupied by the Pilgrim, and the course followed as well as the course to follow. And now, by reckoning, that is by the progress measured on the log, pointed out by the compass, and corrected by the drift, he must alone ask his way. However, he did not falter. Mrs. Weldon understood all that was passing in the young novice's resolute heart. "Thank you, Dick," she said to him in a voice which did not tremble. "Captain Hull is no more. All his crew have perished with him. The fate of the ship is in your hands, Dick. You will save the ship and those on board." "Yes, Mrs. Weldon," replied Dick Sand. "Yes, I shall attempt it with the aid of God. Tom and his companions are honest men on whom you can depend entirely. I know it, and I shall make sailors of them, and we shall work together. With fine weather that will be easy. With bad weather, well, with bad weather we shall strive, and we shall save you yet, Mrs. Weldon, you and your little Jack both. Yes, I feel that I shall do it." And he repeated, "With the aid of God." "Now, Dick, can you tell where the Pilgrim is?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "Easily," replied the novice. "I have only to consult the chart on board, on which her position was marked yesterday by Captain Hull." "And will you be able to put the ship in the right direction?" "Yes, I shall be able to put her prow to the east, nearly at the point of the American coast that we must reach." "But Dick," returned Mrs. Weldon, "you well understand, do you not, that this catastrophe may, and indeed must, modify our first projects? It is no longer a question of taking the Pilgrim to Valparaiso. The nearest port of the American coast is now her port of destination." "Certainly, Mrs. Weldon," replied the novice. "So fear nothing, we cannot fail to reach that American coast which stretches so far to the south." "Where is it situated?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "There in that direction," replied Dick Sand, pointing to the east, which he knew by means of the compass. "Well, Dick, we may reach Valparaiso, or any other part of the coast. What matter, what we want is to land." "And we shall do it, Mrs. Weldon, and I shall land you on a good place," replied the young man in a firm voice. "Besides, in standing in for the land, I do not renounce the hope of encountering some of those vessels which do the coasting trade on that shore. Ah, Mrs. Weldon, the wind begins to blow steadily from the northwest. God grant that it may keep on. We shall make progress, and good progress. We shall drive in the offing with all our sails set, from the brigantine to the flying jib." Dick Sand had spoken with the confidence of the seaman, who feels that he stands on a ship of whose every movement he is master. He was going to take the helm and call his companions to set the sails properly, when Mrs. Weldon reminded him that he ought first to know the Pilgrim's position. It was, indeed, the first thing to do. Dick Sand went into the captain's cabin for the chart on which the position of the day before was indicated. He could then show Mrs. Weldon that the schooner was in latitude 43 degrees 35 and in longitude 164 degrees 13, for, in the last 24 hours, she had not, so to say, made any progress. Mrs. Weldon leaned over this chart. She looked at the brown color which represented the land on the right of the ocean. It was the coast of South America, an immense barrier thrown between the Pacific and the Atlantic from Cape Horn to the shores of Colombia. To consider it in that way, that chart, which was then spread out under her eyes, on which was drawn a whole ocean, gave the impression that it would be easy to restore the Pilgrim's passengers to their country. It is an illusion which is invariably produced on one who is not familiar with the scale on which marine charts are drawn. And, in fact, it seemed to Mrs. Weldon that the land ought to be in sight, as it was on that piece of paper. And meanwhile, on that white page, the Pilgrim, drawn on an exact scale, would be smaller than the most microscopic of infusoria. That mathematical point, without appreciable dimensions, would appear lost, as it was in reality in the immensity of the Pacific. Dick Sand himself had not experienced the same impression as Mrs. Weldon. He knew how far off the land was, and that many hundreds of miles would not suffice to measure the distance from it. But he had taken his part. He had become a man under the responsibility which had fallen upon him. The moment to act had come. He must profit by this northwest breeze which was blowing up. Contrary winds had given place to favorable winds, and some clouds scattered in the zenith under the cirrus form indicated that they would blow steadily for at least a certain time. Dick called Tom and his companions. "My friends," he said to them, "our ship has no longer any crew but you. I cannot work without your aid. You are not sailors, but you have good arms. Place them then at the Pilgrim's service and we can steer her. Everyone's salvation depends on the good work of everyone on board. Mr. Dick, replied Tom, my companions and I, we are your sailors. Our good will shall not be wanting. All that men can do, commanded by you, we shall do it. Well spoken, old Tom, said Mrs. Weldon. Yes, well spoken, continued Dick Sand, but we must be prudent, and I shall not carry too much canvas so as not to run any risk. Circumstances require a little less speed, but more security. I will show you, my friends, what each will have to do in the work. As to me, I shall remain at the helm, as long as fatigue does not oblige me to leave it. From time to time, a few hours' sleep will be sufficient to restore me. But, during those few hours, it will be very necessary for one of you to take my place. Tom, I shall show you how we steer by means of the mariner's compass. It is not difficult, and, with a little attention, you will soon learn to keep the ship's head in the right direction. Whenever you like, Mr. Dick, replied the old black. Well, replied the novice, stay near me at the helm till the end of the day, and if fatigue overcomes me, you will then be able to replace me for a few hours.